Let's bring into the conversation national security expert Hal Kempfer, friend of the program. Hal, I was texting you about this pretty early this morning. I was, struck by these incredible images coming out of the Kremlin. I want to put it up yet again, Hal, of this, what looks like a drone strike there over the dome. I want to put up, Hal, this tweet as well from Jennifer Griffin and get you to respond. She says, according to a U.S. defense official, saying, "We were not given a heads up about the drone strike on the Kremlin. The Ukrainians assure us it was not them. Experts note that this was not a serious assassination attempt since everyone, all caps, knows Putin doesn't spend much time at the Kremlin." Let's start with that fact, Hal. If Putin wasn't even there and it was widely known, why would this have been an assassination attempt? Why there?
Andrew, I've looked at that video. I looked at the size of the drone. It was an assassination attempt. It was about the most poorly thought out assassination attempt I've ever seen. First off, the Kremlin is reinforced. His office has a lot of protection. They've got air defense all around Moscow. They got air defense all around downtown Moscow. The Russians themselves say that they used anti-drone electronic technology to stop the drone. I'm not quite sure what exactly they did. We see it explode, but it does look like maybe the drone went off course and ran into part of the superstructure there. And even though it looks like a big explosion, it's a rather small explosion, which is another way of saying it probably wasn't an assassination thing. All right. So the assassination thing is something that Russia just threw out there. Certainly Ukrainian intelligence would most likely know if Putin was staying at the Kremlin or not at the Kremlin. And so that tends to, on any examination, the idea that this was an assassination attempt on Putin seems to just fall apart. Now, as far as who did it, there's different possibilities, but you kind of got to go through each one of those to figure out. But it does seem to land. Let's just put it this way: the most likely possibility is that it was where the drone actually ended up.
Yeah,
is who decided to put it up there. So.
Yeah, Hal, it seems like there's two tracks we have to take, two kind of competing philosophies of thought here with this story. And Secretary of State Antony Blinken said you got to take what the Russians are saying with a very large shaker of salt. So we can talk about what the Russians are saying, but we also have to talk about the Ukrainian denial. Outright, everyone there, high-ups in the Ukrainian government, coming out full-throated saying this was not us. And then we have to think about false flag operations. Does this have the hallmarks to you of false flag? Because we know Russia, that is their textbook in a lot over the last 20 years under Putin's rule. Is that what you thought of right when you saw this news today?
That was my first thought, was false flag. As someone said, it looks like a put-up job. Basically, it flew over the Kremlin. If you look at how it flew, where it flew, where it exploded, which is directly over the Senate building, which is where Putin's offices are, but not a big enough explosion to cause any serious damage. I mean, the statistical likelihood of all that happening, if it was somebody actually with malice to do so, it just seems rather minuscule when you look at it. If it was a put-up job, it was made for the cameras, made explosion. They caught it on the cameras, and they were able to put it out on. I think the feed that went out first was Telegram, where they put this out there so that everybody could see. Now, it's a medium-sized drone. It's not a really large drone. It's not one of those smaller drones that you see like a quadcopter. It's about a medium-sized drone. The Ukrainians do have a couple of different drones that could have been potentially used. There's one that's homemade, or I should say it's made within Ukraine. There's another that they've been using. It's a Chinese-made drone. Both of those could have made that very long leg over 500 kilometers to Moscow from Ukraine.
Okay.
So it is technically within possibility, but to go through all those air defenses to get into Moscow and to get right to the Kremlin is very unlikely. And then to have it explode where it did explode is very unlikely. The more likely thing is it was something that was launched closer to Moscow, which actually there's more than two possibilities. There's that Putin, the Kremlin did it. Of course, that the Ukrainians did it, which they deny vehemently, and they seem And everything seems to support their denial because, first off, they didn't claim responsibility. Why do it if you're not going to claim responsibility?
Right.
And certainly they would have let us know. I mean, that where things are with the counteroffensive, there's a lot of information sharing. So I don't believe they would have held back on that. And then the other one, there's a possibility it could have been partisans or anti-Putin forces within Moscow or within Russia. That's been talked about. There's also a fourth one, which is something maybe outside. For example, Belarus. There's anti-Lukashenko Belarus partisans, if you will, that could see this as a way to do something that's a little bit further out. And if they did something like this, I think they would have, immediately said, "Hey, we did it. That's us. We claim responsibility." And they didn't do that.
Okay.
So, so that seems to knock them out as far as possibility.
Hal, when I looked at this today and saw that explosion over the dome there, I was thinking to myself, how could Moscow, this major international city, its air be so exposed to this? That was what went through my mind right off the top. And so we're going to have to, follow this. You heard there in that report from Greg Palkot, Zelenskyy is in Finland today. And he was very, forthright about this. He said, throughout the course of the war, we do not attack Moscow. We do not attack Putin. Now, Hal, you and I both know there have been several attempts on Zelenskyy's life, especially at the very outset of the war. And then, of course, you've heard all the threats from Russian officials saying now, things are going to be ratcheted up. It's going to be quite escalatory. They've been doing that for the course of the war. They have been targeting civilians, targeting infrastructure. Do you think anything changes on the battlefield because of what we saw today? Do you think Russia really ratchets up tensions?
Well, this is the fear that everybody has, that he's using this as and it fits. They canceled most of the May 9th events, the Victory Day parades throughout Russia, throughout the various oblasts or regions throughout Russia. The one in Moscow is still going to go, but they said it was because of Ukrainian terrorism. This fits. This provides something to point to with that narrative that had been out there for days about the Ukrainian terrorism. They can actually point to an event, high visibility, and say, aha, there's that Ukrainian terrorism we've been telling you about. And that's a little bit of a face-saving gesture for the Kremlin, because otherwise, what is going on that they can't hold something that they hold every year going back to the end of World War II? So it does provide that. So that narrative seems to fit. The fear is, what will they do? Now, if you're looking at escalatory attacks, they could fire more missiles. Well, they're running out of those missiles that they could fire. They could fire missiles at command and control targets, high visibility targets in Kyiv. I think they've been doing that. They just haven't been very successful at it, but they've been trying to do that. So that one doesn't quite fit. The one that might fit, which is the most worrisome, is that they said, we're going to, basically at a time of our choosing, we're going to choose to retaliate for this. They have called it an assassination attempt on Putin himself. It's in the heart of Moscow. Immediately one goes back to their common rhetoric, or their constant rhetoric, I should say, on nuclear saber rattling and the threat of a tactical nuke. And the fear would be that if there is a Ukrainian breakout, they go right through the lines, they're routing the Russian forces, which is a distinct possibility, all right? In fact, I think it's what Russia anticipates is going to happen, that they might look at using cross that threshold, which in our terms is a huge threshold. In their mental terms, in terms of how they look at military science, it's not as big a threshold for them to cross and consider using a weapon like that. That's the big fear, that this might be used as some sort of justification further on in anticipation that their forces are going to get routed throughout Ukraine, and that and possibly the defeat of what mathematically could be most of the Russian army, because most of the Russian army is actually on Ukrainian soil. So there's a big fear that they may lose basically their conventional forces in one fell swoop. That's the big concern that he has, and that would kind of be consistent. Obviously, we all hope that's not what he's going to do, but rhetorically, he pulls out that nuclear saber every time he can.
That's right.
Now, one thing that, if I could just add, one thing I want to say is, we have seen attacks. There was one thing, President Zelenskyy says, we have enough targets to attack. We don't want deficit, alluding to their weapons and stuff within Ukraine. But there are 2 trains that were derailed that were on Russian soil, taking out, as we talked about early in the war, taking out those rail lines. They don't have great roads in that part of the world. So taking out those rail lines from a operational standpoint is something they want to do to set the stage for the counteroffensive. The other thing they've been doing is they hit that big fuel farm in Crimea down at Sevastopol, and they've hit another fuel farm just in the last 48 hours on the other side of the Kerch Bridge, which was actually in Russian territory. And that was supposed to, as the reports are, that it was hit by a drone. So
okay. Hal,
that's something to consider.
Yeah, definitely. Hal, so we're looking at some of the video from Zelenskyy's speech today in Helsinki in Finland. I want to get your thoughts just briefly here. And lastly, the Washington Post had an exclusive yesterday saying, and Zelenskyy said to their Ukraine bureau chief, I did not receive information from the White House or the Pentagon beforehand, talking about those classified documents that were leaked by Jack Teixeira, the 21-year-old. What are we to make of this? There was an additional $300 million in military aid announced that's going to the Ukrainian war effort today. Zelenskyy said, for us, anything that informs our enemy in advance in one way or another is definitely a minus for us. I don't see any advantages here. Zelenskyy said he heard about this first from news reports. Should U.S. officials have let him know beforehand, do you think?
Well, I think it would have been good for him to at least give him heads up that these were going to show up in the news. All right, if they knew. It's possible it popped up in the news before U.S. officials had a chance to go in there and actually inform what was coming in. U.S. officials may have taken we're going to neither confirm nor deny the veracity of the documents in there. We don't want to have to answer whether some of these things, especially anything about Ukrainian capabilities, their intent, their shortcomings, I can see where U.S. officials wouldn't want to have to explain their assessment, their classified assessment to the president of Ukraine and what was being released. So I could understand that. But I think it probably, considering all the publicity, considering the global publicity on this, it would have been a good idea if we could have to give him a heads up, or at least an explanation saying, look, we're not going to say this is true, but this is what you're going to see released. Okay. All right. And by the way, the president, basically here in the U.S., officials were saying that some of these documents look real. I don't know why we wouldn't tell President Zelenskyy the same thing that we're telling the American people publicly. Okay. Here. Yeah.
All right. Hal Kempfer, as always, thanks for that wide-ranging discussion. Lots of news today to get to, and we appreciate your time, Hal. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew.